New formats can be a little bit intimidating if you're a newer player, but don't worry, I got you covered. Hey, Nick from 9card TCG, and today we're going to be looking at meta share and matchup data for the most common decks in the brand new Scarlet and Violet meta. It's a very new early meta, so a lot of this is likely to change, so take everything we say with a grain of salt. If you're new to the channel or you haven't already, do me a favor, like, subscribe, comment, all that kind of stuff tells YouTube this is a good channel and other people should watch it. Now, all the links to this, like the websites we use, are going to be in the video description if you want to go check it out for yourself. But with all that said, why don't we just go ahead and start taking a look at the decks that are really popular and how they're doing. So we have two different sites that we're going to be looking at right now. The first is Limitless TCG, or Play.Limitless TCG. We can see, and you can see it right here, the decks that are commonly used, the name of the deck, we have the count or the share. The share is usually the more important thing. And we can even see the win percent, how well these decks are doing. And you can sort by win percent. You want to play the deck that's getting the most wins, you can do that. However, it is worth noting that if you do sort by win, there's only one count of like Urshifu Blaziken. So is it really a 60% win rate? Or did this really what happened is this one person had a 60% win rate? When you take a look at something like Lugia Arceus with 126 counts, that 56.47 or that roughly 56.5 win percent is closer to the truth of what that win percent would be, considering that there's much more account of that deck being played. So you see like something like these ones and a two take lower numbers with a little bit less, I don't want to say like validity, because who knows, Urshifu Blaziken may really have a 60% win rate, just not enough people have tried it. Anyway, enough about that, just wanted to point out that one thing that should be considered. So these are really, you want to look at the top 10 decks roughly. At least that's what I like to do when I'm trying to decide what I want to play or things that I should consider, things to expect. I could scroll down, there's all these different decks, but really, I'm not going to be worried about playing Urshifu Moltres or Arceus Ice Rider, Jolteon Samurai. Like they're just not played in enough quantity for me to really care about them. So, I'm not going to. So the decks that I really want to pay attention to are things like Lost Zone, Miraidon, Regieleki, Gardevoir, Giratina, Lugia, Mew, Urshifu, Arceus Giratina, Dialga, Magnezone, and Goodra. And those are the top 10 decks. If you're not playing one of these top 10 decks, it's not a big deal. You can play any deck you want, just know roughly these decks. And those are the decks we're going to focus on when it comes to the matchup data. So while we're on the Trainer Health site, we can look at matchup data, and you can see that this goes in we're going to talk about this matchup data. It goes in alphabetical order, right? So we're starting in Arceus and working our way down to Miraidon. This is for the top 9 or so, 9-10 decks in terms of popularity, because again, we don't really care too much about how the 50th most popular deck does, because not enough people are playing it to care. So we're going to talk about Arceus Giratina. Obviously, if we go in this diagonal, it's all 50%. These are all mirror matches, so Arceus Giratina into Arceus Giratina is 50%, right? It's a mirror. It has not a great matchup spread. You're pretty unfavored into Gardevoir Mewtwo, you're in Urshifu Inteleon, Lugia Arceus, Miraidon. Those are decks that you're pretty unfavored against. The things that you're beating are Gardevoir and Lost Zone. Lost Zone's a really popular deck at about 20% of the meta, so it may, depending on your local meta or your comfort with the deck, your skill with the deck, it might be worth taking unfavored matchups to decks that aren't as common, if it means that when you go to your local League Cup or Challenge or whatever, and you know everybody's playing Lost Box, Arceus Giratina may be a really good pick for that reason. This is 70 games played. We're starting to get into pretty good, like solid numbers there. Same thing with Gardevoir. Fewer games played at 32, but 62.5% is a pretty decent win percentage. So if you're expecting to play those decks, Arceus Giratina may be a good choice. But again, if you're expecting a lot of people to play Lugia, if you're expecting a lot of people to play Miraidon, might not be the best pick. Speaking of Gardevoir, another deck that has a surprising win rate, and it's not really. How do I word this? Gardevoir was expected to be really, really good. And then, after Fort Wayne, people started playing post-rotation a lot more. And they started saying that Gardevoir is kind of mid. It has really good potential, but just falls a little bit flat. And you kind of see it here in the numbers. It doesn't really have anything that's super favored any favored matchups. Its best matchup is Lost Zone Giratina, and that's only a 52% win rate. Again, not very, very favored. Everything else, it's either neutral or doesn't do very well against. And I do think being neutral against a lot of decks is actually not a bad thing, because it means you have an opportunity to win against everything. And if you are skilled at a particular deck, being neutral could be a good thing. So just because you see a deck's neutral to a particular matchup doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's up to you and a little bit of luck to win that matchup. However, Gardevoir Mewtwo is a different story. This deck is actually pretty solid and is doing real well in terms of matchup spread. I mean, the only thing it's not favored against is Lost Zone box, but otherwise, you're doing pretty solid. So if you do really like Gardevoir, you want to start playing with some of the newer cards, perhaps Gardevoir Mewtwo is a better option. I mean, you're beating regular Gardevoir 66% of the time. You're beating Urshifu Inteleon 66% of the time. Again, that makes sense because you are hitting Urshifu for weakness, and you're able to deal with the Inteleon. So, you know, something there. Lugia, you're beating 62% or 61%. You're pretty split with Mew. You are neutral, obviously, in the mirror. You're neutral with Miraidon. So, really solid matchups. And that's just because Mewtwo V Union is really solid. It can't be targeted by effects. So, in the Lost Zone matchup, you can't get hit by Sableye. In the Giratina matchup, you can't get hit by Giratina's, the Star Requiem. So, that's one of the reasons why you have really good matchups. Once that Mewtwo comes into play, it's really annoying, and Mewtwo can put damage counters, like 16 damage counters on your opponent's board, which is crazy. Using Sableye is annoying. 16 damage counters is absurd. Speaking of Giratina Lost Zone, not as good matchups as everybody kind of expected. And that's another thing we see in the meta share. When a deck is incredibly powerful, a lot of people are going to be playing it, and this is, at least according to Trainer Hill, number 5 on the list in terms of most popular. So, or number 4 in most popular. So, I think Limitless might have it at number 5 or whatever. But the idea is it's only about 10% of the meta, roughly. Not as nearly as high as I think everybody expected it to be based on early results in Japan. And you kind of get an idea why. It has one favored matchup into Mew Genesect, and that's because they usually run a Drapion. So now you Star Requiem 1 Mew Vmax, get 3 prizes, and then you Drapion the second Mew Vmax and get your other 3 prizes, and you win in 2 attacks, and those attacks have a combined energy cost of 2. 1 grass and a psychic. You just got to get 10 cards into the Lost Zone. You can stall long enough with your Comfies and Cramorants to deal with things like Meloetas if you have to. You can use them to just boss Genesects, things like that, kind of slow your opponent down a little bit. You have some options and some ways of dealing with Mew, which is why you do so well. But some of these other decks might be a little too fast. Some of these like Miraidon decks, where Miraidon Regieleki, Electric Wall, hits your opponent, deals 100 less damage during their next turn, which means Spit Innocently not only does 10 damage, which just isn't enough. So they're hitting you for weakness into the Cramorant, they're KOing your Cramorants. Even without weakness, it does 100 damage, and Regieleki VMAXs can increase that by 30, so now you're hitting for 130. Enough to KO Cramorants, enough to KO Comfies and Sableyes and Radiant Greninjas. So all of those single prize Pokemon that you want to use early can't actually do what they need to do because Miraidon Regieleki provides a wall and damage buff to KO them. And you're like, well, alright, fine, I have the Giratina, but Miraidon can get powered up super, super quickly thanks to something like Electric Generator, a new item card that lets you just attach energies from the top of your deck if you find them. So now you can hit a V Pokemon for 220. Oh wait, you're actually hitting it for more than that if you have Regielekis, and you can hit for more than that if you have a Choice Belt. So with 2 Regieleki Vmaxes in play, that 220 actually gets bumped up by 60. Now you're hitting for 280, which is enough to knock out a V-Star in one hit. And you only need 1 Vmax if you have a choice belt, because you hit 30 more damage into a V. So it makes a lot of sense why you lose to something like Miraidon Regieleki. It makes sense on why you lose to things like Arceus. They have really good single prize. Urshifu and Tyranitar are really good 2 prizes that don't need to evolve to do big damage. Stonjourner is just a good single prize Pokemon for a lot of the Lugia Arceus builds, so kind of makes sense there. They're able to trade favorably back and forth with Lost Zone decks. Lost Zone box, again, they're trading even more favorably because they're almost exclusively single prize Pokemon. Maybe they have a Dragonite in there. Maybe they have a Raikou to do big damage, something like that. Urshifu Inteleon, you can Star Requiem once per game. So you can get rid of an Inteleon VMAX once per game, but how are you getting rid of that other one? Unless you have a really good setup where you can ensure a KO with the loss of impact on a second V-Star, which is probably where you're getting some of those wins. But let me tell you, between Radiant Alakazam and Yoga Loop, it might be a little bit difficult to actually make that happen. Urshifu Inteleon is a deck that I really like. It has some kind of polarizing matchups. The decks where you lose, but otherwise you're doing pretty well. And it's one of the reasons why you see it doing so well in online tournaments right now. I mean, the only decks it really loses to is Lugia Arceus and Gardevoir Mewtwo. And even regular Gardevoir, you're kind of split against because they don't have, a lot of times, the damage output to deal with the Inteleon VMAX, because they just Cheryl, heal all the damage, and then continue to attack. And they can, again, Yoga Loop maybe some of those lower HP Pokemon, like the Curlias, like the whatevers. So, something. You lose to Lugia Arceus because they have really good single, 2 prize Pokemon, basic Pokemon that just throw down and they can hit for a lot of damage. That Tyranitar can hit for 320 damage. I think, right? 240 plus 80. They hit you for a lot of damage with those single strike energies. Plus a choice spell means that one-shotting your VMAX with the 2 prize Pokemon. And if you run the build that I use, that has single strike Urshifu VMAX, well, then you are able to Gmax 1 ball and knock out anything in the game in a single hit, thanks to something like single strike energy. And oh, by the way, you can recycle those energies with Urn of Vitality, so you can recover those energies and continue to attack. And they just don't have the damage output to really deal with your big number attacks. So there you go. Mew is an interesting one. You're pretty split. It makes sense. Mew can do a lot of damage with power tablets and choice belts and things like that. And also Urshifu is weak to Psychic, so that's kind of a problem. You beat Miraidon most of the time. They're an all-electric deck. So yeah, your Inteleons are an easy target, but you have Urshifu, and that's kind of a fun matchup. I just played it recently with Gym 9 TCG, so go check that out. Link. The card might be up there somewhere eventually. Lost Zone box, again, the decks you lose to. Everything else, you're either pretty favored. You're not really split with a lot of stuff. You're winning to Gardevoir, you're winning to Giratina, you're winning to Miraidon, you're winning to Genesect. Beating Miraidon is interesting until you think the other way around, because we talked about how they have the electric wall and with the Regieleki and how it can make Spit innocently not do enough damage, except this Lost Zone box has now things like Galarian Zapdos, something that can just one-shot a VMAX or one-shot any of their electric Pokemon. It does a lot of damage, and it doesn't take a lot to power up because they're going to have a few Pokemon V in play, thanks to the Regielekis, to reduce the attack cost of Galarian Zapdos. Also, you have Mirage Gate. So you just power it up even if they don't have a lot of Vs in play. You power it up pretty easily. Lost Zone box now usually includes something like a Galarian Zapdos, where the Giratina Lost box does not. You can't squeeze in that extra V Pokemon most of the time. So Lost Zone box has things like Dragonite and Galarian Zapdos to deal with those other, basic EX and Pokemon VMAXs, something that Giratina might struggle a little bit to do. But otherwise, Lost Zone is pretty good. The other deck you're losing to is Arceus Giratina, because it's really hard to deal with the Arceus with Sharon's Care. That makes a lot of sense. Giratina just has a lot of health. They can hit you with Shred, Evolve, Lost Impact, Star Requiem. It gets kind of annoying to deal with. But for the most part, I mean, yeah, that makes sense. Urshifu Inteleon, you do lose to. Again, you just don't have the damage output to deal with this Rapid Strike Inteleon when they constantly heal with Cheryl. They're moving damage counters over. They're using Yoga Loop. Rapid Strike Urshifu can hit 120 to 2 Pokemon, so they can attack the bench. It can get really annoying if you don't have a really solid, strong setup. Lugia Arceus is still so good. I mean, you're beating Urshifu Inteleon so much of the time. The only thing you lose to is Gardevoir Mewtwo, and that kind of makes sense because they're able to spread a bunch of damage out and take out your Arceus, which is really, really annoying. It's how you get the deck to go. However, Tyranitar can one-shot a Mewtwo V Union pretty easily, honestly. It's just a matter of, can you get set up fast enough? They throw down like a Milk Tank, okay. You have Stonejourner, that'll one-shot it. You have something like the Arceus that can one-shot a Milk Tank, since they don't have Cape of Toughness anymore. They don't have Big Charm anymore. So you don't really have to worry about Milk Tank too much. So now we can go ahead and really... The reason we lose to that, though, we lose to Gardevoir Mewtwo. They can ramp sometimes faster than you can. Lugia lost a lot of consistency without having Evolution Incense, Quick Ball, easy ways to find and discard something like an Arceus. Now we're a little bit more reliant on capturing Aroma, which means you have to be really smart about using your Professor Burnett and your Lumineon. You flip heads, okay, I can get the Arceus. I flip tails, so maybe now I have to get the Lumineon so that I can get Professor Burnett and just discard the 2 Arceus. But it never really feels good to have to do that because it's extra bench space. It's just supported for the turn. You might need a Lugia still. You might really need to hit a heads on a capturing Aroma to get a Lugia VStar. There are ways it goes really wrong really quickly, and if you're me, you consistently start everything that is not Lugia. I don't know why. I just do. But it just happens. But you have really good matchups. Gardevoir Mewtwo is like the only thing you really have to worry about for now. And this is a fair amount of games. Some of these... Lugia has a lot of games played against stuff. People are still playing Lugia. Why are people still playing Lugia? They have the cards, right? They have the cards. They know how to play it. That's why you see it being played so much. Same thing with Mew. Mew is one of those things that it just does well against everything. The worst matchup you have is Lost Zone Box. But otherwise, you're pretty neutral to most things. Again, 47%, 48% is not very unfavored. You start getting into like 46% territory, and you're like, all right, you're probably going to lose this matchup a little bit more than you'd like. But again, a skilled pilot, a really good Mew player, can beat anything it goes against, especially if you high roll. If you high roll, you're just winning everything. I've learned that from experience. And the Miraidon Regieleki is very, very split. To this left half, you're doing pretty well. To this right half, not so much. You're losing to the Urshifu Inteleon, the Lost Zone Box, the Lugia Arceus, the Mew. Why are you losing to these 3 decks? They all have fighting types, right? They all have fighting type attackers. Even the Mew Genesect just hits really, really hard thanks to something like Power Tablets. So Melodious Echo is another way that they can hit really hard and they can set up very, very fast. Miraidon, it's either you set up and you're attacking immediately, or your Miraidon or your active Pokemon's getting KO'd the next turn. It's very kind of hit or miss, and I feel like a lot of these decks can be. Lugia is very hit or miss. You get your Arceus, you get your Lugia, you're good to go. You don't, you're gonna be in for a rough time. Something like any Lost Zone deck, you can't find your Chorus, you can't find your other Comfeys, you can't find like your switch cards. To build that Lost Zone deck up, or that Lost Zone count up, you're going to lose. Arceus Giratina, you can't find your Arceus VStar, you can't get a double turbo energy, you're in a lot of trouble. Inteleon Urshifu, depending on what you're playing against, you're either always seeing your Inteleons against Miraidon, or you're always seeing your Urshifus against Mew. It's just how it happens sometimes. So I do think that's something that we see in this format quite a bit, is a lot of these decks can struggle to set up, and Mew is no exception. Miraidon is no exception. But it does lose to decks that have fighting type attackers. Urshifu is a fighting type. Lost Zone can get Galarian Zapdos. Lugia Arceus has Stonejourner. Mew is just Mew. It hits really, really hard. And then for the decks that don't, the loss of Giratina, the Gardevoir Mewtwo, the regular Gardevoir, Arceus Giratina, you have a much better time against those decks. So, all of this to say, every deck has things that it beats, and every deck has things that it loses to. Your job is to find a deck that you enjoy playing, and then learn the matchups. If you're playing something like what Lugia Arceus, you're gonna beat Urshifu Inteleon a lot. Maybe you play that matchup a little bit to learn it, just so you kind of know what to do. But then you go and start to focus on, okay, what do I do against some of these matches that are more unfavorable? How do I ensure that I beat Mew more often than I don't? How do I turn this 50% roughly matchup against Gardevoir to a winning matchup? What are some things I can do? And sometimes you can't do anything. Sometimes you just lose to a deck, right? The counters exist. But in something like this where it's a 50% chance, maybe it's as simple as I need to go first. Well, in the games you go first, you win. In the games you don't go first, you lose. That's a reality at times. But learning how to take those neutral matchups and flip them by becoming a more skilled pilot in a particular deck is the name of the game. So there you have it. Meta shares the matchup data for some of the most popular decks in this budding format. I want to know what you think. Tell me comments below. You can like, comment, all that kind of, I did it already. I'm done talking. I'll see you next time.